Good morning, guys, and welcome to Gamers Guides. I hope you're all keeping safe and well during these uncertain times. So let's jump straight into it with the next Gamers Guide. I'm MattG. Now, last time we were talking about the iceberg theory, and I'm basically going to be carrying on from that with the width versus depth argument. Now, I will say I'm getting into this a bit late because the argument is predominantly depth. Now, for those of you who don't know what width and depth is in regards to world building and writing, they're basically two different methods of bringing your world together. Now, width is basically considered the more unhealthy of the two, and generally considered the more cheapskate option. It's basically where you throw in literally anything and everything because it's cool. Because having monsters in a world in a fantasy setting works. It sells, so therefore let's throw it in. Having political systems works, and so let's just throw it in. And generally, the idea of width is that you don't examine the consequences of having these in place. You generally find these in very broad projects, particularly in video games. I find Skyrim is definitely an example of this, where it's a world just brimming with different information sources, all sorts of different points, but they don't work with each other. But I'll go into examples of that in a minute. And then depth, obviously, is its opposite. We basically have points where you go into excruciating detail about specific points of your story and throw in so much detail that if anybody was to ask what would happen in this situation, there is an immediate answer available. And this is why depth tends to win out, because in wide situations you generally come across plot holes in your writing. Now, I'm not saying that width approaches to world building are crap. I have come across several width-based stories which I love. Elder Scrolls definitely being high among those. So yeah, let's go straight into the different definitions of width and depth. Let's start off with width. Now, as I said, width doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a bad story. The reason why I don't particularly like width is because of its tenacity for plot holes. I'll give you an example of this in relation to Skyrim, which is the example which I've given. But the main one that people generally pick at is the spell Transmute. Okay, so the reason why people pick on this is because it basically gives the adventurer or anybody who's able to use it the ability to turn iron into silver and then silver into gold. Okay, so pretty useful skill to have if you're an adventurer, but particularly if you're smithing up jewelry, if you decided to adopt silver weaponry to hunt monsters, that sort of thing. But the problem is that the currency system in the Skyrim world is gold coins. So obviously, being able to just magic gold into your lap is going to be particularly problematic for the economy. So, but the problem is that the game doesn't recognize this. It doesn't acknowledge it in any way that this is going to be a problem. So, what people generally pick at is that there are all these different situations that you can apply an imaginative mind to, and the game isn't able to compete with it. Now, obviously, it's a game. It's not a different player. It's not but yeah, it's not a different player. It's not an AI. It's not able to compete with you just based on the fact that it is limited by being a computer game. But that are there's an entire list, literally, somewhere on the internet of all the different plot holes that I come across with this whip system. Now, loads of people will probably be wondering why go with width if this is a problem, particularly in massive monetary projects like things like Skyrim or pretty much anything else, any book, any project at all. Why go with width? And the main problem with these massive projects is that you have a lot of people working on them. So if you have all of these different people who might be communicating with each other, who most probably aren't, simply because of the workload, you are going to come across these different problems. So somebody was in a department who made this transmute gold spell. Another person was running the sort of like economy system. Basically said, okay, let's make gold coins our currency, simply because that's what we've done in the past. And these people probably weren't in contact with each other. But of course, you could always just say, well, I don't give a crap about what people think about plot holes and stuff. You know, I'm just going to do my thing because it's my thing. Of course, you are 100% able to do that. It is your project. You can do whatever you like with it. My concern with width is simply that it will annoy your audience. An annoyed audience is people say there's no such thing as negative criticism. Those people who say that have never been criticised for writing a novel. So be aware of that. So let's jump into depth. There's loads of examples of depth. The Witcher series, Lord of the Rings. And I'm not just talking about the games, I'm talking about the books, the TV series, the games. The amount of depth that I have seen in The Witcher, which I have to admit I wasn't expecting that much depth, simply because of the way the books are set out. For those of you who don't know, whose experience with The Witcher has just been the games or the TV series, basically the first two books, which I consider books 1 and 2, I'll hasten to add, it's basically a series of short stories about Geralt in the time before he rescues Ciri. Spoilers and all that. And a lot of these are very not linked, shall we say. But there's a story of how Geralt basically interacts with the Beauty and the Beast storyline. There's a story of how Geralt gets involved with the romance between a mermaid and a duke. But there's obviously the story about how the child of surprise concepts come in. And these stories are immensely detailed in various points, but as I said, they're very not connected. So I was actually very surprised to find out just how in depth these storylines were. I mean, you've got entire languages set up. You've got entire cultures for the different races, and then cultures within those races. And I have to admit, I was very, very impressed, particularly whenever I then moved on to the games from the books. That's basically the order they came for me. It was the TV series, the books, then the games. And one particular point which I was really impressed with was something that came up in The Witcher 2, and it came up just in passing, and it is pretty much the prime example of how you should show off your depth in writing. So I'll put out the spoiler warning and all that, but basically in one of the branches of the storyline that you can do, because there's a major plot point where the story diverts into two different directions. But on one of those storylines, you can get in contact with a dwarf, who is sort of like the mayor of the town. And he is basically alcohol free. He's completely teetotal, and he has been for some time. Now, in dwarven culture, this is a big no-no, because dwarves are renowned for being epic drinkers. So you can effectively blackmail this guy into revealing his secret, and he'll then do whatever it is that you need him to do. Now, I particularly found this fantastic depth, simply because the the writer has basically taken this well-established point in fantasy that dwarfs are epic drinkers, and has basically applied this to a culture system instead of just accepting it, and basically just saying that, okay, dwarves drink, good for them. But this guy has basically taken this idea of dwarves drink, what can we do with this? And basically say that, okay, so people who are teetotal, who don't drink or can't drink for whatever reason, they're ostracized from the society. They are the lepers, they are people who are spat on in the street. And I loved this. Obviously, the morality points and all that, ignoring those, but just writing this concept, I love that. But yes, and I'm getting a bit emotional about this, but it is a perfect example of how to apply this. He didn't bring in the entire 900-page book on how to be a dwarf in the Witcher world. He literally just picked out this one point, literally just plucked it out, dropped it in their labs, and I can tell you, but 99% of the audience on this point probably didn't even notice. Yeah, and that is the beauty of depth. You throw in these wonderful points, and you're so subtle about it that very few people actually register them. But in their subconscious, they basically say, okay, dwarven culture is established in this world. So okay, so and it basically makes them think that, at least in the back of their minds, oh, I wonder what else is dwarven culture about this. So, but for those of you who aren't video gamers, I really do suggest at least playing the Witcher series or watching walkthroughs of them, just so you can get a glimpse of just how beautiful these storylines and scripts are. So I've diverted quite a bit of time towards that, so let's basically talk about why depth occurs. In a nutshell, depth occurs because people put effort into it. That's pretty much the only way around it. So you can't have depth through shortcuts. But depth is the gritty, the blood, sweat, and tears sort of stuff in regards to writing. You can't get around it. But obviously, there are exceptions to that. Some people do. But as I said in my previous video, if you're going to you go put as much effort as you are going to need to in order to fake depth, you might as well make depth, in a legitimate sense. So depth basically occurs because people put effort into it, they put time into it, they work up some sort of note system or a very well organized system in their head, and they basically say, okay, this is a feature that I'm putting in my book, what can I do with it? What are the consequences of them doing it, and does that lead to other things that can be done? And this basically leads to what is regarded as reader payoffs. And it's basically a point where a reader will go into a book, particularly a fresh book, and they will know literally dick about it. Obviously, there are things on the back cover or reviews or spoilers that people can throw out there, but majoritively, when somebody picks up a book, they don't know what it's about, other than they're reading the back, looking at the front cover, and seeing that this is a book about aliens or wizards getting on trains and going to wizard school. This basically comes into a point called the learning curve, which I'll go into in another video. But the basic principle with depth is that if a reader was to pick up any book and go to, I don't know, page 400 out of 500, and basically read it from that point onwards, they would not understand a single concept that is going on in this storyline other than the basics. This guy swung his sword and killed the monster or something like that. But so the book is basically an education point, going along throughout the entire book, where the reader basically becomes an expert on everything that is going on, so that when they get to this point, it was like, oh right, so that's what that concept meant. Or yes, we have these people who are called Jedi. It sounds corny, but it's awesome. They have laser swords. Why do they have laser swords? Doesn't matter. Go with it. And all these different points. But as I said, I'll do another video on the learning curve at another point. But that's basically why people do depth, to educate their audience on just basically how brilliant their world is. As I said in the previous video, this is where your originality comes into play. So stories about adventurers who go off and save the world and then come back, it's been done. How you address this in your world building, in your depth, that is what makes your book an original piece, and in most cases a brilliant piece. Alright, so let's move on from width and depth and basically talk about how you make something deep in your storyline. Okay, so I'm sort of going into this from the viewpoint of a particular person, Brandon Sanderson. Now, for those of you who don't know who Brandon Sanderson is, he is effectively the need-to-know guy in regards to world building, fantasy, and science fiction storylines. But he does a number of lectures on YouTube regarding this, so I definitely suggest that you pick those out. But he basically talks about his world building in two senses, the physical and the cultural. Now, we'll start off with the physical because it's shorter. The physical is basically the world that exists around the characters, and it exists regardless of whether or not the characters are aware of them. It does sort of apply to the cultural setting as well, but specifically in the physical sense. These are things like the landscape, the fact that what colour the sky is, whether or not gravity exists, the landscaping, the shapes of the continents. These are the physicality things of the world, the things that make the world tick. But even if the characters weren't there, these things would still exist. When we're talking about whether or not the character is aware of them, if you basically have a character which is called the other, like I talked about in previous videos, we'll basically have characters who, in this otherness, are travelling to a new world which they have had no concept of before, or limited concepts. But regardless of their informity on the subject, these concepts still exist regardless of whether or not the character is aware of them. Okay, and generally in this physical setting, you'll usually find that unless you're describing something particularly fascinating, the storyline doesn't necessarily require you to go into a lot of detail about these. You can basically say they crossed a field, and generally the audience is clever enough to know what the field looks like. They know that the grass is green, the sky is blue, that water is wet. These are sort of assumed concepts, so unless you're going to deviate from these and say that the sky was a constant pinkish orange, or the field contained a particular plant which we don't have on Earth, or something like that, you don't usually need to describe these or go into a lot of detail with them. Where your detail comes in is on the cultural setting. Okay, so cultural settings. In definition to them, these are basically everything that build up, shall we say, society, for the different characters. Now, there are different points in how these two definitions can cross over in certain aspects. Examples of this can basically fill up an entire list of different points. So we've got like education, architecture, laws of war, caste systems, languages, folklore, history, weapons, technology, gender roles, music, philosophy, customs, human rights, prejudices, cursing, swearing, slang. But literally all of these apply to the cultural settings. These are sort of like the little nooks that and linchpins that basically make up but the cultural settings of any society. And bear in mind that if you're going to really leap into this, but all of these points are going to vary depending on the different societies that you're actually going to be looking at. But so say you're doing a fantasy story and you basically have three different types of elven cultures, a multitude of different human cultures, different orc cultures. Each one of these cultures are going to have their own different variations on how these are all put in. So, which basically raises the question of which one do you focus on? Yeah, but obviously, if you were to write up an entire list of what builds up any culture at all in a very general sense, and then basically say, okay, I've got 500 different examples of what makes up a culture. How do I do anything at all with this? But without wanting to gouge my eyes out after I've done this and not be utterly exhausted. The simple point is that you just focus on maybe 3 of these points. So, but let's take an orc culture, for example. We sort of go with the assumption that they are a warrior caste system. So you basically talk about the different rankings, the weapons and technology. You talk about gender roles, whether women can be soldiers as well, or if they've got some sort of sexist system in place, which then brings in prejudices. We then have all these different points that you can focus on in a very sort of more narrower sense, but still gives you the full broad spectrum of this culture. Now, I will say, in regards to depth, that's generally the go-to, to basically have narrow depth, but obviously if you have the time and more importantly the patience, having wide depth is generally a good place to go. I will say all of us sort of started with J.R.R. Tolkien and his theory on world building, where basically world building and novelization is a method of delivering. Where novelization is a method of delivering your world building as opposed to world building delivering narrative, but that took him the better part of 40 to 50 years for his entire lifetime. So obviously, if you don't have that much time, which I'm assuming you don't, then go with a more narrow sense and work on it. If you're particularly if you're doing a series, because the point of a series is to educate the audiences on new concepts, but not so new that they're unable to become educated on them by the end of your book. A particular example of this I found was in the last Harry Potter book, where you've had all this build-up over the last 6 books, learning about new concepts, new points, and then the one thing that basically wins the day is this completely random point, which arguably has been completely pulled out of someone's ass. Nobody knew about it before. It has never been talked about before, and this random concept is suddenly the one and only thing that can do anything at all to defeat the bad guy. And stuff like this is an example of sort of like wide world building, where you basically just suddenly throw in these concepts because they are cool and good, and there's no sort of like reader payoff for it. No one can basically go into it and say, "Oh yeah, I remember reading about that. I know what that means." There's none of that, and it creates a negative sort of feedback in regards to that. Now, I should probably do a sort of like warning page and things that you shouldn't do, in regards to depth and world building, and the main one, which I'm going to continuously bring up, simply because it's so easy to fall into, I've done it myself, is info dumping. There is this thing called world builder's disease, and it's basically this concept that where somebody basically says to themselves, okay, I have spent a year working up this world building. I am going to throw it in the face of everything and everyone that reads my book, and I'm going to make sure that by the end of my book they are going to know everything there is to know about it, because I have worked so hard on this and I want people to know that I've worked hard on it. It happens. It might sound ridiculous, particularly whenever I put on that sort of emphasis to it, but it happens. There are times where people will basically spend an entire page worth of writing, basically just talking about the architecture of one particular building, which the characters don't even go into. There might even be pretty much an entire book's worth just talking about the culture of one particular group of people, which the characters aren't even part of. But yes, always be wary of info dumping. Worst case scenario, info dump, and then once you've gone through the entire book, then trim it down. That is more or less what most editors will ask you to do. But because the point of the narrative is to keep the story going, as opposed to delivering what you are doing in terms of your world building. Tolkien created a narrative to basically help deliver that, and so from what I can tell, that irritated him quite significantly. So if you basically want to do world building for the sake of your narrative, then I would suggest basically have your world building ready, to some degree, write where you info dump into it, then trim it down after you've done the writing. It is immensely depressing to do that. I've literally just finished doing that for my book Conspirators, which hopefully will be published in a few weeks now. It's the most soul-sucking exercise I've ever had to do in my life, but it works. Yeah, it is worth it. But the one thing that I will say is, in regards to, shall we say, workshopping, get somebody to go through it and basically ask them, is there too much information here? Is there too much information here? Is there not enough information here? And generally speaking, people will say yes. Yeah, there's too much emphasis on this point. There's too much emphasis on this point. I don't see why this is in there. And work on that. Obviously, it's your own writing. If there's something that you're particularly proud of, stick with it. No one can tell you what to do with your own books. I mean, they can if you're going through traditional publishing, but in terms of like you writing a book for your purposes, no one can tell you what to do. Alright, so I blathered on for all of that. I hope this has been helpful for the writers out there. I'm not entirely sure which one I'll go do next. I might do something on the learning curve. I might do something on something else. If you guys have any requests, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And until then, peace out, stay safe, and stay at home.